I'm obviously not Aaron. He's out on a trip this weekend and asked me at the end of last week if I wouldn't mind filling in for him. So he gave me all of his notes. And so you'll have a decent class, at least for that case. And we're going to be in Daniel chapter 3. Is there anybody that has any kind of prayer request or anything before we get started? Maybe I'll open with a prayer. All right, well, let's go ahead and have a prayer. Our God and our Father in heaven, we come before thee this morning, thanking you for the chance that we have to be able to study, to be able to be together. We're thankful, Father, for another week you've given us, for the privilege and opportunity to praise you, to worship you, to try to learn better how to bring glory to your name, and, Father, how to love and be with one another as Christians. We're thankful, Father in heaven, for all the blessings available to us through Christ, for everything done for us, and for this hour and opportunity of study. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, again, we're going to start off in Daniel chapter 3. There are a few questions about some of the dates in Daniel chapter 3. In some of my own prep that I tried to hasten through this weekend, I read some material that was presented by, I think, Roy Hearn and some other commentators. And I've read over Aaron's notes. As far as the dating, there's some differences of opinions about it, and that goes into when some of the statue, for example, was built and other things of that nature. So we're not exactly sure of the exact date, but we have that the LXX, the Theodosian, I suppose is the way to say it, Syriac version of the Old Testament all state that it was during the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, which would be about 586. This would make it the same year that the temple is destroyed, or was destroyed in Jerusalem, and the city was sacked. As far as to how far along that was, I believe I also read it was perhaps around 3 years or so after 3 years at most after the vision in Daniel chapter 2, and that was stated by Roy Hearn, and his thought was that, well, it wouldn't have been that long after, because he would have heard the vision of him being that head of gold on that statue, and he would have said, well, let me go and build a giant statue of gold. So there's a couple of thoughts there for that. Let's go ahead and start reading. It says in verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold whose height was 80 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits, and he set it up in the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. So the question I've already alluded to is, why would he build a giant gold statue? Well, most likely because of the vision that was explained in the previous chapter. So he's going to have this kind of sense of pride about himself, especially after that. Of course, he's already a very powerful king and a rich ruler. He already had a sense of pride in the first place, and he would have heard that vision explained and said that thou art the head of gold. So it's no surprise that someone with that kind of ego might go ahead and build a giant statue of gold. So it's possibly just that dream which Daniel had interpreted in chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2, verse 37 and 38, he said, you, O king, are this head of gold. So maybe the statue was a statue of Nebuchadnezzar himself, or maybe it was a statue of one of his false gods that were worshipped there in Babylon at the time. He, as I've read, has been said to be a worshiper of Marduk. I believe that's how you would say it. So maybe it's of Marduk, or maybe it's something of a combination of honoring Marduk and himself. The statue was 60 cubits high, 80 cubits. So 20 being the score, so 80 cubits and 6 wide. Cubits roughly 18 inches. So you have 60, you take half of that and you add it on top and you got 90 feet, right? 18 inches, 12 inches is a foot, you got 90 feet. So to give you some perspective on that, 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide. The Colossus of Rhodes was built about 300 years later, and it was 70 cubits high, or 105 feet. So ancients had some technology that was able to do this. They were smart enough to figure out how to build large statues. It was likely not fully gold, of course, but overlaid with gold. That was interesting to me. I read some comments about that as I was studying, and I read his notes, and I saw that, and I said, that's a good point. Because I believe hearing in my past that if you added up all the gold, you could make a cube of gold that all the gold we've ever mined, and you put it in one place. If you could put it all in one cube, it wouldn't be much bigger than 3 or 4 average sized family homes if you piled them all together in terms of the volume, the space that it takes up. So we wonder why gold is so expensive. It's really rare. So it's highly unlikely that he had that much gold to make an entirely pure gold 90-foot statue. So it's likely overlaid. We see that done in other places in the scriptures. That's not uncommon. It was common during the time. Of course, Exodus 32, Isaiah 40, verse 19, Isaiah 44, verse 10, and Jeremiah 10, verse 4 and 14 all talk about metalwork and some other things that have been crafted and overlaid with gold. You see that David overlaid some things with gold, or Solomon and others overlaid things with gold. We had things overlaid with gold when they were building the tabernacle and Ark of the Covenant and other things of that nature. Similar sized statues in America. Again, continuing with perspective. The Statue of Liberty is about 151 feet tall. So it was shorter than the Statue of Liberty, but that's still pretty big. If you put that Statue of Liberty on a pedestal, it's 154. Lady of Rockies, Montana is 90 foot. The Golden Driller in Tulsa, Oklahoma, 76 feet. And Sam Houston statue in Huntsville, Texas is 67 feet. And of course, Athena, the replica of Athena in the Parthenon in Nashville, is 42 feet. So it's still very large. If you want to put that in a perspective here, I think it's about 19 feet from the bottom floor, not the pulpit here, to the ceiling in here, if I remember right. It's around 19 feet. That's it's 60 cubits, so 90 feet. So if you could imagine that scaled up, you take this distance you see here and just project that out a little bit more, about 4.5 times higher. That's how tall the statue was. It's pretty big. It would have been easily seen by the crowd and those who were around it where it was built, and that would have been important, I suppose, for the coming section in Daniel chapter 3. The plain of Dura, that was ancient Babylonian documents, mention this place, but its exact location is never actually said. So we're not precisely sure, we're not 100% sure, but we have some evidence where people think that it may have been located. Would have been south, let's just say there was a large platform that has been found 6 miles south from the ruins of the ancient city of Babylon, so the old Babylon. And that platform measures about 45 feet by 45 feet by 18 feet. And so it's possible this was the location of the statue. That would have been the base or the footing of it that they could have prepared. Daniel chapter 3, verse 2 reads, Then Nebuchadnezzar, the king, sent to gather together the princes, the governors, and the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counsellors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces, to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. There are ancient records of Sargon II, or Sargon II, do discuss these types of assemblies, and there are some specific definitions of these positions that are listed in the BDB Hebrew lexicon. Aaron recorded there for us, so if we want to reference that and look up more information, we can. I guess I'd like to do kind of what he does. We can get everybody else a little bit involved. Would somebody like to read a verse or two? We have several here in a row before we get more into it. We have 3 through 7. Somebody want to read that for us? Take part in that? Just read that section. I think it'd be good. Read verses 3 through 7.
Okay, so the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counsellors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald cried aloud, To you it is commanded, O peoples, nation, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, In symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. So at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, harp, and lyre, in symphony with all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up.
Of course, we find out that that's all of the people except for three, right? Those three Jewish eunuchs. Verse 8 says, therefore at the time certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. Well, that idea, that phrase of accusing them means that they were, well, I say it means, it carries this idea, this connotation of chewed or ate to pieces. It's like, in a sense, they were chewing them out, sort of, but to the king. So they were harsh about it. They weren't just timidly, oh, well, sir, did you know? No, they were upset that they hadn't obeyed the commandment, possibly jealous because of the position that they had been given. Their position, and of course Daniel's, see, they had been promoted in the previous chapter. Verse 9 says, they spoke and said to the king, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon. See, they know who they were, of course. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. They have been set over the affairs of the province. It says, likely, of course, that reference to Daniel chapter 2, verse 49, where Nebuchadnezzar had promoted them at the request of Daniel, of course, because of his interpretation of the dream. You gotta ask the question. There were three of them there, and it gives the names. We know it's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. But where is Daniel? Likely Daniel was still in the king's court, because I would lean towards the belief that if Daniel had been there, he also would have stood. He would not have bowed. We see that in his character throughout the book of Daniel and what we know of him. So Daniel's likely not there at this instance. Daniel 2:49 seems to indicate that they were serving in some different titles. So Daniel would have been in a slightly different position, perhaps higher, of course. The plain of Dura, as mentioned earlier, is believed to be about 6 miles south of Babylon. So Daniel was likely back in the city. That'd be the best guess. And also there's some proof of 6th century authorship here and who is writing this story, in that, well, it's more likely that if, as some claim that this was written much later, some say that it was written in the 2nd century, that they would not have left Daniel out of this. So it just points to the character of the book, saying, well, if this was really written by somebody other than Daniel, and at that time, they would have likely just thrown Daniel in with the rest of them and kind of made up that story. So this kind of leans towards the other direction of that, obviously. Daniel chapter 3, verse 13, then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. So they brought these men before the king, in rage and fury. So this is the same man, for example, that Jeremiah 52, 8 through 11 speaks about. We can go there and turn there really quick so you can get an idea, look at the character of him. Jeremiah 52, 8 through 11. Somebody want to read that for us? Get another volunteer. Anybody? Yeah, go ahead.
But the army of the Chaldeans pursued the king, and they overtook Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho. All his army was scattered from him. So they took the king and brought him to the king of Babylon at Riblah in the land of Hamath, and he pronounced judgment on him. Then the king of Babylon killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, and he killed all the princes of Judah in Riblah. He also put out the eyes of Zedekiah, and the king of Babylon bound him in bronze fetters, took him to Babylon, and put him in prison till the day of his death.
Right. So, rage and fury means something more than he slammed a few doors and got really mad in the face, right? When you're talking about the king of Babylon, he pulled Zedekiah in front of him, and I forget how many sons he had. If anybody remembers, then go ahead and say it. But he put them all in front of him, made sure to kill them in front of him, and then put his eyes out, so that's the last thing he'd ever see. Right, so 70. Yeah, I wanted to say that. I thought I heard that in a previous class, but, So that's a different level of rage and fury. When this man is mad, he does severe things. So we're all told about that when he killed his sons and how he killed them in front of that king, put him out. You wouldn't have wanted to make Nebuchadnezzar angry. So he spoke in verse 14, going back to Daniel 3. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up?" He said, "Now if you're ready at the time, you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" It's an interesting question at the end, of course. Who is the God that will deliver you from my hands? It's, I guess, a confusing statement because previously in the last chapter, towards the end, he said a few things about the God who was their God. Some quite profound things about him, really, although he didn't go far enough. The God of Daniel, who interpreted his dream, of course, is the God who may deliver them from his hands. You look back in Daniel chapter 2, verse 47, I think is where we see what he said. Let's turn back there really quick. You have to bear with me because I'm on my computer, so it's a little bit easier for you to flip those pages. He said in verse 47, "The king answered unto Daniel and said, Of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret." So Daniel explained the dream to him. He understood the significance of how special that was, that Daniel had gotten that revelation. But then right here, he seems to have forgot what God it would be that could deliver them from his hands. So maybe he just had a short memory. Of course, it already said that he was in rage and fury, so it's most likely that he wasn't really connecting those dots at that time and thinking about that. But it's also true that he had a certain kind of ego about himself as well. He had elevated himself probably in his own mind, as we see certain men do throughout history, to being one of the gods, or as if he were a god, or as if he had more authority than many gods, because he believed in multiplicity of gods, of course. So possibly he had that short memory. We see that sometimes even in well-meaning men, that we don't always connect lessons. Like the disciples had a short memory after Jesus fed the 5,000. There was no ill intent on their part, but sometimes people tend to forget about the past, the things that they had learned about God in the past when there's something new is coming along. So if we're honest, sometimes we also have short memories, but that's not to try to minimize exactly what Nebuchadnezzar is about to do. Of course,
the fact that they believed in a multiplicity of gods and ascribed to them, powers, things that could be done by their gods. For Daniel's God to have done something, that was a great thing. He's glad he got his dream interpreted, but he still doesn't really believe in the one true God.
That's right. That's right. And that's part of the reason that many don't think that this was later in his reign, but it was earlier in his reign. I mentioned earlier, some think it was quite a bit later in his reign when he built the statue. But if you look a little bit further into the book, you see him being humbled by God, having to go out into the field, and he eats as if he were a beast, right? So this is most likely before that time period where he went through those trials. Had it been after that, I don't know that he would have said the things he said and acted the way he acted. He would have understood in a very real and personal way just who their God was and what he could do if he had lived through that already. So absolutely. But he asked that question, who's the God that's going to deliver you from my hands? Perhaps, he's not thinking much. He hasn't had much experience yet with this God. He's thinking there are many, and I don't think that your God is going to deliver you, because after all, your God's already failed you and delivered you into my hands. I've already taken you captive. Perhaps your God is real, but I've still already overcome him. So who's he? Who's he going to be to stop me now? I've got you here. So maybe he's thinking that way as well. Absolutely.
The ego that he has, I know your God did this for me, but I'm never committed to you.
That's right.
He's putting his whole self way above what God has done for him already.
Right. One way or another, no matter how much he understands or doesn't understand, he's absolutely putting himself above the Lord Jehovah. He's putting himself above the God that he at least has an understanding that exists, but he doesn't think he's great enough to stop him. He's elevating himself. Daniel chapter 3 verse 16 says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. Boy, that really would have made him upset. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from this burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. So God had saved them from execution already in Daniel chapter 2. You see that you go back and you read chapter 2, the king was going to put to death many of those people if they weren't able to tell him what his dream was, and then also tell him what the interpretation of his dream was. And they were able to do so, unlike the others in his court. So God has already intervened. So they have that faith that's been bolstered by their experience with God and their faithfulness to God, resulting in that. They prayed, and God had answered. But they said in verse 18, but if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. So regardless of what was going to happen to them, they have an understanding that this life, I suppose, is not the end of it. We could put it that way. That there's something greater and more important than preserving your own physical well-being when it comes to your faithfulness. So they said, even if our God does not save us, we won't bow down to this statue. And they did it because they knew it was wrong. Period. They didn't care if it meant physical death. That's kind of the idea, the epitome of Revelation 2:10. We've heard that quoted many times in the invitation because it teaches us that this is the kind of faith we need to develop and have when we become Christians, when we become children of God. We need to be like this example that we see here in them. It doesn't really matter what the alternative is. If someone asks you to do something that's going to be just on the face of it wrong, we say no. We're not being threatened with fiery furnaces in the U.S. right now, but we're oftentimes put in positions where we have to think about our ethics. Maybe it's, I don't know where everyone works. Maybe it's at work. Maybe work wants you to do something that's not ethical. Maybe there's something going on with the law that may come up that asks you to do something that's not ethical. We have to be the kind of people that's going to look at it and say, God will deliver me, and even if he doesn't, so be it. I'm not going to be focused on the end all of this life being that I preserve my body. And that goes along with the idea of, fearing God, not them that can destroy just body, but him that can destroy both body and soul, right? So maybe they remembered the stories from their childhood. Maybe they remembered those stories of the times that God had saved Israel against all odds. Maybe they remembered what happened in Daniel chapter 2, but either way, they decided they were going to be faithful.
I believe that what you said a moment ago is really where we need to focus on, that this life, is just temporary. I think they realized that. They were looking like the Apostle Paul, where the need to live is Christ, that die is gain.
Right.
They understood that no matter what, they were going to be faithful, even if they had to perish. Because once this life is over, it's much better for them.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we need to always remember to focus.
That's right. I think they had learned the lesson that God intended to teach the nation. I could say that too, right? They had been led off into captivity because of Judah's unfaithfulness, and they decided they weren't going to do that anymore. They had looked at maybe the mistakes that had been made from those who decided to compromise, and they're not going to do it anymore. That's ultimately one of the most important lessons, period, throughout the Bible. Faithfulness above all else, no matter what it may cost you. No matter whether it costs you family, friends, financial well-being, it doesn't matter. You put the Lord, you put what the scriptures say first. And this was going to be a gruesome death, we could add. Being burned alive. I'm sure that some men could think of ways to torture people more, but that would not be a quick and painless death. So they knew what was waiting for them if God chose not to deliver them. Daniel chapter 3, verse 19, Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. I remember reading some about what kind of furnace this likely was, and perhaps he even has some of that in his notes here. If he does, we'll glance over that part, whatever he has to say. Aaron prepared for us, but it's likely a furnace made for forging iron, is what I've read. And it could have been that it was built in such a way that there's a ramp leading up to the top of it, and that there may have been an opening, and they would be cast down into it, because you see later that Nebuchadnezzar comes up and he looks in from, I suppose, the bottom where it would have been open, where you could have retrieved things that you used the furnace to refine. But 7 times hotter means this is going to be number one, it's a large enough furnace to hold men. It's going to be one that's used for forging things in extreme heat, and he wants it to basically be as hot as it can possibly be. 7, I guess, sometimes represents completeness. Perhaps that's the idea here. He just wants it to be as hot as you can possibly make that furnace. But he commanded certain mighty men that he had, men of valor, who were in his army, to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, verse 20. And he cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men, they were bound in their coats, their trousers, their turbans, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. This was the dress of Babylonian officials. They had been promoted, and they were, of course, servants of the king, so they would have had nice clothing. Verse 22, therefore, because the king's command was urgent, and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. I don't know exactly how that would have happened. How the 3 men who went to toss them in would have died. Of course, I understand why they didn't. Perhaps they got up to the entrance and they had to throw open some door, some way that opened it, or perhaps it was just so hot and they were in such an urgent rush to follow the king's command, because he's already angry, and if they don't immediately do it and make him happy, they're going to be next anyway. So they're going about trying to hurry up and get this over with, get this done before the king turns his anger towards them. You couldn't have stood before the king, being one of his men of valor, and said, well, king, I'm a little nervous about walking up here with these 3 guys. He would have just thrown you in just as well as them at that point. He's already about to burn 3 of his high-ranking officials, let alone 3 of his soldiers, men of valor. So the king, in verse 24, was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? And they answered and said to the king, true, O king. So the 3 men had been cast into the furnace. Yet it seems that the king is able to see them. So how is it possible? So yes, he actually did have some notes here about what kind of furnace. He said some think it was an iron forging furnace. So it would have had steps going up towards the top. Maybe some think earthen ramps, I've read, being one suggestion, would have been up at the top. And it makes sense they'd have furnaces there on location. They were building this giant statue. So perhaps it was laid out in that way. We see that furnace and ironwork has been done for quite some time throughout the scriptures. So some people might say, well, an iron furnace, I don't know if that would have been done. Is this early or late enough in human history for ironworking to be done? Well, we see ironworking starting as early as Genesis 4:22. Deuteronomy 4:20 mentions some ironworking. Judges 1:19 mentions some ironworking. Judges 4:2 and 3 references iron and iron furnaces. And of course, you see that throughout. You see, I think, was it Sisera maybe in the book of Judges had 900 chariots of iron. So it could have been that kind of furnace. Some think it was large, domed kiln. And that's kind of what I would imagine it would be. That's based on archaeological discoveries. It seems that this could have been a large domed kiln with an opening at the top and maybe a ramp or some steps or something. And they would have put charcoal in and been able to take ashes out and things there at the bottom. So there would have been an opening at the top for, of course, the exhaust to come out, and then an opening at the bottom to deal with what you're working with. So the king is standing out, and he would have been able to see in through that opening and see what's going on inside. Well, in verse 25, he says, "Look," he answered, "I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire. They are not hurt, and the form of the 4th is like," the King James says, "the Son of God." Most others I've read have said just a son of God or one of the sons of God. Because of the way that that's phrased, many have asked this question, well, was this the pre-incarnate Christ? Because of the way that it in particular is phrased in the King James. The ASV is another one of those that reads a son of the gods. And of course, I don't know much about the grammar of Aramaic, but Aaron mentions here for us, there's no definite article in the Aramaic. Gods is also plural in the Aramaic, and there's no capitalization in the original. So the argument shouldn't be used that it's capitalized, therefore it's got to be the pre-incarnate Christ. That's just the way that it's been translated or recorded in some of our modern translations, that it's shown that way. Not only to mention that, but the fact is we've already talked about, well, what was Nebuchadnezzar's idea of who God was? I mean, he would have had no clue who the Son of God was proper. Any inkling or understanding of Jesus or who would become Jesus from the Godhead. So the likelihood is that he saw a being, and I mean, you can think what you want of it. I mean, more likely I would lean towards it being a representative of God, perhaps an angel. Perhaps it was, I don't know. But there's no reason to think that Nebuchadnezzar actually knew for certain, is the point. So how would he know what, for example, the pre-incarnate Christ would look like? I don't think he would have. Jewish tradition expresses that they think it was Gabriel. Take that for what you think that's worth. There's some other interesting passages that may relate to it. Isaiah 43 verse 2 and Psalm 66:12, if you want to write those down. Aaron thought that those would be good passages to go along. Verse 26, "Then Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke. He said, 'Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here.' Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego came from the midst of the fire. And the satraps, administrators, governors, and the king's counselors gathered together, and they saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of the fire was not on them. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, 'Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him.'" I guess there we could say some idea of what the king thought it was. "And they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this." Well, this is a punishment like Daniel chapter 2, verse 5 mentions. We can go back there and glance at that and see that he's said similar things before. Daniel 2 verse 5 says, the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, this thing is gone from me. If you will not make known unto me the dream with the interpretation thereof, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. That's an interesting punishment, to say the least. They're going to be cut in pieces. The ESV, I think, is another translation that says they're going to be torn limb from limb. Some believe that this included tying them between animals, or maybe even between the tops of 4 trees. They could have bent over the tops of 4 trees, tied the individual up, and then loosed them so that as the trees, that's a little gruesome to think of, split apart, they would have torn these people apart. An ash heap or rubbish or dunghill is rather descriptive. He would have turned their house into what is basically a public bathroom. That would have been a shame not only on them but on their entire family, for if their family even survived, I suppose you could say. We've seen what he did to Zedekiah and his sons.
And it says, the angel of the Lord encamped around about them that fear him and delivers them. So that's definitely what happened right here.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good verse. What verse was that?
Psalm 34:7.
Psalm 34, verse 7. You can add that to some notes. So, reach the part where we ask ourselves, when we read through this chapter, what does this mean for us? What are some practical takeaways that we can have? Well, number one, we can learn the most obvious lesson, one that we talked about a bit earlier, Joe emphasized, and others. No matter what happens to us while we're alive here, no matter what challenge is put before us, no matter what choice we have to make, faithfulness to God is going to be rewarded. Maybe it will be that God will deliver us from our situations here. Maybe it will be that if we're faced with some choice at work, pressure from, I don't know, perhaps even the government some days in some form, maybe we'll be delivered from that and we'll find another job or another way out. Maybe we won't. But it doesn't really ultimately matter, because as Revelation 2:10 emphasizes, faithfulness unto death is what's going to lead us to receive that crown of life. What are some other practical lessons we can learn from this? Well, that lesson starts with the idea that we can say no. And that should be the first step. When we have that choice in front of us, someone's trying to push us to do something, we can say no. And we can say it strongly because our allegiance is to God. What's something else that we could learn? Anybody have any comments about that? A lesson we could learn?
The difference in the trials that people had then and during the beginning of the Christian age, and what we think that we are suffering here.
Right. Yeah, there's a good maybe not what contrast. I was trying to think of the word, not comparison, contrast between what we're dealing with here and there. And maybe that's sometimes why it's hard to understand and relate to this, because we don't really relate to it directly. A lot of the trials we have aren't as severe. And we need to be able to look at that and do our best to prepare in case something like that does come. But the fact of the matter is, we don't typically have to deal with those kind of issues. And so much more the shame for us then if we do buckle under the pressure that we do have then, right? Considering what we're facing and what we have to deal with is so much less than what they had to deal with. That idea is definitely a strong lesson, a good one that we should reflect on and meditate on. What's another lesson or something interesting we could point out here? I'm trying to give opportunity.
I don't think they didn't have to get together and discuss what their answer was going to be. It was predetermined they were going to do the right thing. Didn't matter if God saved them or God didn't save them.
Yeah.
They knew he was capable of doing that, but they really didn't know he would deliver them. But it didn't matter. They were going to do the right thing either way.
Right. So he's emphasizing, that's a good point. Brother Dwayne says there was no discussion. They didn't huddle up and meet and think about what do we need to do. They just immediately said, hey, no, I'm not going to do this. That's interesting to me, because that kind of goes with, and that's really good. That goes along with the idea of what integrity is. They didn't need to deliberate about what was going to be done They already knew what was going to be done ahead of time. If they were ever faced with a situation like this, I suppose you could say, like this or anything else, there was no need to discuss it. They knew what it was. They lived within their integrity as far as the way that they had their faith. They didn't have to discuss it and figure it out and weigh whether it was the best thing or not. They just immediately acted and said, no, we're not going to do that. They didn't have to think about it. So they had strong integrity in the situation and strong faith in that situation. Any other lessons? If not, I think we'll dismiss maybe 3 minutes early. I ran through his notes pretty quick, and I appreciate the attention and the time given.